This screencast follows on from the screencast on variation and looks at aspects of evolution. So the first slide here deals with what led Darwin to propose his theory of natural selection. Okay? Very simple observations from which he made inferences from, which led him to put forward this proposal of natural selection, and we'll just talk you through this now. Okay, so he made 4 observations based on a number of stimuli, partly his experiences going to the Galapagos, and partly his experiences with artificial selection. But anyway, here we go. Here are his 4 observations. The first very simple observation he made is that offspring tend to have some form of similarity in characteristic to their parents. Okay, so heredity. Okay, so characteristics passed on from generation to generation was one observation. He also noticed about variation within a species, intraspecific variation. I know 2 individuals are identical, which we talked about in the previous screencast. He also noticed that organisms tend to produce large numbers of offspring. They produce large numbers of offspring. Okay, but from generation to generation, in most species, the population remains stable. Okay, so population stability, despite the fact that organisms produce large numbers of offspring. Okay, so how he used these observations to make some inferences which led to the idea of natural selection. Okay, 3 and 4 here. Okay, ideas 3 and 4 mean that not all these offspring survive. Okay, large numbers of offspring, but stable population size. Therefore, not all the offspring survive. Okay, and then because of 2. Okay, because of variation, okay, what he proposed was that the individuals that did survive were better adapted to their particular environments. Okay, so their adaptations influence their survival. Conversely, individuals poorly adapted to their environment had less chance of survival. Okay, and then finally, because of the fact that these characteristics are passed from parent to child. Okay, so they pass from generation to generation. So the adaptations that survived, okay, pass down to the offspring. Okay, so the offspring then have those adaptations for survival. Okay, so that is the process of natural selection. Okay, and as natural selection goes on and on and on over generation and generation, this leads to changes in characteristics within a particular species. Okay, and that is known as evolution. Okay, so I've written down here: natural selection is selection by environment of particular individuals that shows certain variations. These individuals will survive to produce and pass on the variation to the next generation. Quickly looking at that in diagrammatic form, I found this little diagram with some unnecessarily complicated words. Okay, but we've got equating this to my slide up there. We had 1. Okay, the fact is that we pass characteristics on from generation to generation. Heritable differences, we talked about that. 2, individuals are unique. 3, super fecundity, which basically means that they produce lots of offspring. And 4, population remains constant. Okay, so 3 and 4, okay, what they do is that leads to competition. Okay, the fact that not all organisms survive, and it's not random which organisms survive and which don't. Okay, it's the idea that the survival is influenced by the characteristics. Okay, so characteristics and competition. Okay, characteristics and competition results in particular individuals being selected, if you like, and then those characteristics are then passed on to the next generation. Okay, and with time, from generation to generation, this leads us to changes in characteristics within a species, so that they suit their environment or the niche they live in more and more. And if environment changes, those characteristics will change with the environment too. Okay, so that's the first idea of natural selection. Okay, so this introduces an idea of how new species form, which is a word, speciation, you might not have come across before, which very simply means formation of new species. Okay, first of all, if we define the term species, okay, you've probably looked at this in the classification unit. Okay, a group of organisms that can reproduce and produce fertile offspring. Okay, is the way that we define species. Okay, speciation, which is the formation of new species, occurs when a population of the same species evolves to become so different that they can no longer they're no longer reproductively compatible. You can't reproduce with each other. Okay, and the key thing that needs to happen with this is that groups within a particular species need to become reproductively isolated from one another. Okay, so that they can't reproduce with each other. Okay, and then what happens is that the two groups that can't reproduce with each other evolve differently. Okay, natural selection results in them evolving differently to the extent that they can't reproduce with each other, even if they had the opportunity. Okay, so the key thing that has to happen for this speciation to occur is isolation. Okay, and there are two words, new words that you've got to pick up here: allopatric and sympatric, which are two different types of speciation. Allopatric is probably the easier one to visualize. Allopatric is when this isolation, okay, reproductive isolation, occurs due to some form of geographical feature. Okay, so example I've got here of these large birds that live in southern hemisphere countries: ostrich in Africa, emu, Australia, rhea in South America, is that they would have lived in the large continent which existed millions of years ago, which I think was called Gondwana land, and that continental drift meant that those land masses, South America and Australia and Africa, all drifted apart, and the birds that the original birds then, through different environments, natural selection resulted in evolution, okay, to form these birds, which are still similar-ish but very different, and they wouldn't be able to reproduce with each other if they were introduced to each other at this stage. Okay, Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands with their different shaped beaks, depending on what they feed on, would be another example of allopatric speciation. The finches isolated from each other for the fact that they live on different islands, and the islands are too far apart for the finches to fly between the islands. Okay, so that's allopatric speciation or allopatric isolation, in that there's some geographical feature which has separated two populations of the same species. Each population evolves differently due to natural selection because of different environments, and they evolve to the extent that they wouldn't be able to reproduce with each other if they were introduced to each other again. There's another type of speciation which we can talk about, okay, which is sympatric, which essentially means there's some sort of non-geographical isolation of two groups within the same population, and this can be due to all sorts of reasons: different courtship routines, anatomical, genital incompatibility, biochemical fertilization being prevented for some sort of reason. Okay, so this happens to two groups of the same species that actually live in the same geographical region, but for some reason the two groups have become isolated from each other. Okay, so below here, just summarising that speciation, two populations become isolated from one another. Okay, one or both populations evolve to an extent that can no longer reproduce with the other population. Okay, so that summarises what speciation is all about. I've got some little diagrams and animations just to illustrate this below. The first one here looks at allopatric speciation. Okay, a silly animation which illustrates it rather nicely and uses all the relevant words you need to know.
Here, on a small planet not unlike our own, live a race of creatures called lumpties. For millennia, they lived, worked and played and had plenty of fun. Unfortunately, due to a freak galactic accident, their world changed considerably. The land masses drifted apart, some to the frozen north and some to the warmer south. The northern landmass became very cold over time, while the southern one became very warm indeed. The race of lumpties was split into two groups, each inhabiting their own unique land mass, and so they became isolated from each other. Look at what happened to the tribes of lumpties as their environments changed. Each group of lumpties have adapted, over many generations, to suit the environment in which they live. This is called adaptive radiation. How will this change of environment affect their appearance? And why have these changes taken place? Over time, the lumpties changed so much that they finally became a new species. This is called allopatric speciation.
So that deals with allopatric speciation. The other type of speciation we encounter is called sympatric speciation, and I'll illustrate that with this diagram below. If you can imagine this scenario where we've got a type of fruit fly which feeds on apples from apple trees, and there are certain fruit fly which have a tendency to gather on red apples, and another group of the same species which has a tendency to gather on green apples. Over a period of time, and due to natural selection, what will happen is that these flies will evolve slightly differently to these flies over here. Perhaps these flies might develop colorations to make them more camouflaged on a green background, whereas these flies here develop colorations through natural selection to make them more camouflaged on a red background. And after a period of time, there is no crossbreeding between these flies, and they develop different courtship rituals, and they evolve so differently that they couldn't even reproduce if they tried to, and therefore we would have two different species of fruit fly. Okay, so these have become genetically isolated, but not through a geographical reason such as we encountered when we looked at allopatric speciation. So in summary, we see that speciation requires some sort of isolation. That can be allopatric through some sort of geographical isolation, or it can be through other reasons. It could be behaviour, courtship rituals are different, anatomical incompatibility of genitals, or some sort of biochemical one which prevents fertilisation. Again, this would also be genetic isolation, which would lead to new species. Okay, and speciation, two populations become isolated from each other one or both populations evolve to the extent that they can no longer reproduce with others. Moving on to the next slide, okay? This looks at the evidence that we have that this evolution has occurred. One of the problems with evolution is that we can't actually see it happening in front of us because it happens over such a long period of time, but there is some evidence that we can rely upon, or we can call upon, to try and support the fact that there are changes in the structure and characteristics of organisms within a species, and that speciation has occurred, etc. Okay, so the various things you've got to know about fossils, you've got to know about DNA, and you've got to know about molecular evidence. So let's deal with this one by one. So fossils, I'm sure you've all come across fossils before. Okay, so what they are, they're the remains of organisms which are preserved in rocks. Okay, so what happens is that an organism dies. Its soft tissues break down, but its hard tissues, such as bones and shells, what happens is that they hang around for many years, and they get covered in sedimentary rock. Okay, and the water trickles in, and there's all sorts of precipitation reactions, which mean that the shapes of the bones we get an imprint of the shape of the bones in mineralized form. Okay, which creates these rocks which look like organisms. Okay, what then happens is that this sedimentary rock gets exposed through erosion and shifting morphology of land. Okay, we get cliffs and so on, where these fossils are exposed. Okay, and what they do is they reveal the shapes and structures of organisms that lived in the distant past. Okay, and they show that those are different from the organisms that we have at present. We also show there's lots of species have died out. Okay, and also that new species have arisen. Okay, and this brings us all sorts of questions about why particular species died out. A great debate over why the dinosaurs died out, etc., and why have new species replaced old ones. Okay, problems with the fossil record, that there are gaps. Okay, it's not a complete record. Okay, and this is grasped upon by doubters of the evolutionary theory, that there isn't actually a full fossil record, and therefore it's not a particularly reliable source of evidence to support evolution. Okay, and we can look at all sorts of interesting aspects of evolution, such as the evolution of the horse from smaller organisms with toes to larger organisms, where the middle toe has evolved and changed into this hoof structure, which allows for the organism to run faster and therefore escape predators, etc. Okay. Next is DNA. Okay, with our ability to be able to sequence bits of DNA, what we find is that species which are closely related have more similar DNA, very simply. So closely related species diverge more recently, and evolution as a result in change in sequences of DNA. Organisms that diverge more recently have more similar DNA. Okay, so we can just compare sequences of DNA to find out which organisms we're most closely related to. Okay, and this is a very important feature within the whole business of classification these days, which you studied in a different unit. As well, DNA is not the only macromolecule we look at. We find proteins common to all organisms are a good thing to compare. Okay, so there is an enzyme called cytochrome oxidase, which is a key component of aerobic respiration, and therefore most organisms have cytochrome oxidase. So we compare the amino acid sequence of cytochrome oxidase in different species. Again, we find the species which are more closely related to us have more similar amino acid sequences in their cytochrome oxidase enzyme. Okay, so again, I've illustrated some of those ideas with some animations and some diagrams. Okay, this first one looks at the process of fossilization. I'll quickly show you this. So here we have some aquatic animal, some fish or shark which has died at the bottom of the sea. And what happens is that soft tissues start to rot down, as they would do. Okay, decomposes, rot down, but it's hard tissues, it's bone, etc. doesn't. Okay, and over time, what happens is that various sedimentation occurs on top of the hard bone remains. Okay, and it builds up over time. Okay, and then increases pressure, downward pressure of the mass of this sedimentation. All the sediment then turns into rock. Okay, and then liquid trickles into these structures. Various precipitations occur, and then we get a mineralized imprint of the bones. Okay, then what happens is the land masses move for various reasons, and in this case we've got obviously the receding, probably sea here, which exposes a cliff, and as the, if you like, the cliff rises out of the water. Okay, suddenly the fossil gets exposed. Okay, so that's how fossilization occurs. Okay, moving down to another little diagram. This diagram here, okay, shows us the number of amino acids different that various cytochrome oxidase enzymes in different organisms are. Okay, so compared to ourselves, compared to human beings. So chimpanzee cytochrome oxidase is exactly the same as ours. Okay, rhesus monkey is only one amino acid different. Rabbits are 9, cows are 10, etc. All the way down to yeast, primitive yeast, which are a completely different kingdom of organism to ourselves, have 42 different amino acids in their, or amino acid sequence in their cytochrome oxidase compared to humans. Okay, wheat germ plants, 37 different. Okay, insects, okay, which are still animals like ourselves, but obviously of insects which are very different from mammals, are 24. Okay, so that shows the difference in amino acid structure of cytochrome oxidase, and the more distantly related the organism is to us, the more different their cytochrome oxidase is. Okay, slide. Okay, this slide links the words variation, adaptation and selection, okay, and tries to talk about how these are components of evolution, okay, which I think we've really covered in the slide on Darwin's 4 observations and subsequent inferences, okay, but variation is key, which is why we study variation must exist. Without that, evolution can't occur. Okay, and new variants within the population caused by mutations are hugely important to evolution as well, because without new variants, evolution wouldn't really occur. Okay, so if there is variety amongst individuals, then the environment selects the variations that provide advantage. Okay, and that's selection. Okay, so organisms with advantageous variations have a better chance of surviving. Okay, and the consequence of that is if they've got the advantageous variation and manage to survive, what happens is that they have a greater chance of reproduction. If you live longer, you're likely to produce more offspring. Okay, and if you produce more offspring, you pass more of your alleles on to the next generation. Okay, and therefore the subsequent generations are better adapted to the environment. Okay, and that I've got a diagram there, which a very simple little diagram, which we can use just to put all that together. Okay, so here we've got some form of insects. Okay, and what we say is there's variety with these insects. There's green ones and orange ones. Okay, and the green ones are slightly easier to see on their background than the reddy brown ones. Okay, and therefore in terms of the environment they live in, okay, the predator, these birds here, okay, will eat the green ones. Okay, so what we're saying is that the orange ones are better adapted. Okay, so variation means that we have green ones and we have orange ones. Okay, but the orange ones are better adapted. okay, because they're more difficult to see and therefore less likely to be eaten. Okay, they therefore survive. Okay, and what they do is they pass their genes for having orange colour onto the next generation. Okay, so the next generation tend to have orange colour. Okay, so that links the idea of variation. Okay, selection is the act of the birds eating the most conspicuous insects. Okay, and adaptation is the fact that what happens is that after a generation the insects tend to be orange coloured, and obviously over lots and lots of generation we'd have the species would start to become more and more orange and better suited to the background that they live in, and be better camouflaged from the predators. Okay, so that if you like tries to illustrate that slide for you. Okay, so moving to the next slide. Okay, the next slide requires you to discuss why evolution of pesticide resistance in insects and drug resistance in microorganisms has implications for humans. Okay, so what I'll quickly take you through is the mechanism by which insects might become resistant to insecticides, and obviously the fact that we have insects which might be resistant to insecticide has implications for humans. Okay, is that once we've got an insect resistant to a pesticide, the insect can't be controlled. Okay, and obviously if the insect can't be controlled, that affects all sorts of things. Can affect how well crops are grown. If the insect is eating a crop and we can't control it, it means that obviously we produce less crops, which becomes more and more of a problem. Okay, or it could be the control of the Anopheles, the female Anopheles mosquito, which carries Plasmodium, which we studied recently in this module. Obviously spraying insecticides around, if the insects become resistant to it, that's not going to have the desired effect, and therefore we will have a greater instance of malaria. Okay, so those are some implications for humans. Okay, the second one looks at microorganisms, bacteria, and that they become resistant to antibiotics. Okay, the issue for this is that antibiotic-resistant pathogenic bacteria that cause disease, if they're resistant to antibiotics, okay, and this occurs a lot in hospitals, we end up getting more deaths due to bacterial infections, because we just don't have the antibiotics to treat these resistant bacteria. But I'll first of all look at the mechanisms by which insects become resistant to pesticides, and also how bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. So moving down to look at, first of all, got this animation here, which I shall talk you through. So here we have some insects, and these insects are buzzing around. Now these insects will have, there are millions and millions of these insects, and some of them will have had random mutations, okay, which enable them to be resistant to a particular pesticide. Okay, they haven't necessarily responded to the pesticide because they haven't been exposed to a pesticide yet. It's just that random mutations happen in genomes, and a random mutation might have occurred within a few of these insects, which would make them resistant to particular chemicals. Okay, so they're buzzing around. Okay, and then what we do is we spray them with some insecticide, some orange insecticide. Okay, so a sort of purple insecticide. We dust them with this insecticide. Okay, and it gets covered in their bodies, and the majority of those insects will succumb to that insecticide, and they will all die. There you go. They all died, apart from a few insects which have had these random mutations which make them resistant to that insecticide. Okay, now these insects don't have much intraspecific competition, so they have lots of food, okay, and they reproduce with each other, and very quickly, okay, they produce lots and lots of offspring, and all of these offspring, okay, well, most of these offspring will have the resistance to the insecticide, and then we've sprayed the insecticide again, but this time the insecticide doesn't have any effect on our insect population because they're all resistant to our insecticide. Okay, so that's the mechanism by which our resistance to insecticides happens. Okay, so moving on to the next idea. This little diagram here explains exactly the same principle that would occur with bacteria. Okay, so you've got some bacteria. Okay, so most of them would be non-resistant bacteria. Okay, wouldn't be resistant to antibiotics, but they do grow and multiply, and some of those would have mutations in their DNA which would enable them to be resistant to an antibiotic. Okay, then when they're exposed to antibiotic, most of the bacteria will die, leaving our few resistant bacteria. Okay, these bacteria again, okay, they then, because of a lack of intraspecific competition, okay, they have access to lots of nutrients and food and whatever. They therefore rapidly divide, okay, to produce a strain of bacteria, all of which are resistant to our antibiotic. Okay, and if obviously this bacteria is a pathogen, okay, that provides us with a lot of problems in that it means that the pathogen will cause disease in a human which we can't control with an antibiotic, okay, which is becoming increasingly more and more of a problem in hospitals. Okay, so hospitals where a lot of antibiotic is used because there's obviously a lot of ill people there, and therefore in hospitals we tend to produce these resistant bacteria, okay, and then obviously they infect people, operating theatres, etc. Bacteria get into wounds, okay, easily, and they can't be treated with antibiotics, and then a lot of patients sadly succumb to antibiotic infection. Okay. So that finishes our look at various aspects of natural selection, evolution, speciation, and then this bit here about the problems that the use of antibiotics and pesticides causes for human beings due to the evolution of microorganisms to form resistant microorganisms to antibiotics, and the formation of pesticide-resistant insects.